The humid Virginia air hung thick over Naval Amphibious Base Little Creek as 5 elite Navy SEALs surrounded a seemingly defenseless woman in the equipment storage facility. What started as cruel hazing was about to become the most humiliating moment of their military careers. Because when they tore her shirt, expecting to find weakness, they instead discovered scars that would make hardened warriors drop to their knees in shame. This is the story of Susanna Ford, and how a single moment of revealed truth changed everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Naval Special Warfare Training Compound as Petty Officer Second Class Susanna Ford made her way through the administrative building. Her footsteps echoed softly against the polished linoleum floors, a rhythmic sound that seemed almost hesitant compared to the confident strides of the other personnel moving through the corridors. At 28, Ford carried herself with an economy of movement that some might mistake for timidity, but those who looked closer would notice the calculated precision in every step, every gesture. Ford had arrived at Little Creek just 2 weeks prior, transferred from what her paperwork vaguely described as administrative duties overseas. Her file was surprisingly thin for someone with 6 years of service, a fact that hadn't gone unnoticed by some of the more observant members of the special warfare community. But in a world where operational security often meant that the most important details were the ones never written down, thin files weren't entirely uncommon. She kept her sleeves rolled down despite the oppressive Virginia heat, a habit that drew occasional curious glances but no direct questions. Her uniform was always impeccable, pressed to razor-sharp creases, boots polished to a mirror shine. Everything about her appearance screamed regulation compliance, the kind of by-the-book perfectionism that some interpreted as overcompensation for insecurity. The Naval Special Warfare community was tight-knit, insular, and notoriously difficult for outsiders to penetrate. It was a world where reputation mattered more than rank, where respect was earned through shared hardship and proven competence under fire. Ford, with her quiet demeanor and mysterious background, seemed to exist on the periphery of this brotherhood, acknowledged but not truly accepted. Her assigned role was in logistics coordination, managing equipment inventories, scheduling training resources, and ensuring that the various SEAL teams had what they needed when they needed it. It was important work, certainly, but it wasn't the kind of high-speed, high-stakes operational role that carried prestige within the community. To many of the operators who passed through her office, she was simply part of the administrative machinery that kept the base running, visible but ultimately forgettable. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Thompson was among the first to take notice of the new arrival, though not necessarily for reasons Ford would have appreciated. Thompson was a 12-year veteran of the teams, a man whose reputation had been built on 3 combat deployments and an uncompromising approach to maintaining what he saw as the proper order of things. He possessed the kind of confidence that came from surviving situations where confidence was often the difference between life and death, but like many strong personalities in high-pressure environments, that confidence sometimes manifested as arrogance toward those he perceived as weak or unproven. "Who's the new paper pusher?" Thompson had asked Petty Officer First Class Jake Morrison during Ford's first week, nodding toward where she sat at her desk, methodically working through a stack of requisition forms. Morrison, a communications specialist with 8 years in the teams, glanced over with casual interest. Ford, I think, transferred in from somewhere overseas. Logistics coordination. "Looks like she'd jump at her own shadow," added Petty Officer Second Class Ryan Chen, a weapons specialist known for his sharp wit and sharper tongue. "Wonder what she did to get stuck behind a desk instead of real Navy work." The conversation had been typical of the kind of casual assessment that happened whenever new personnel arrived. In the special warfare community, everyone was constantly evaluated, measured against the standards of warriors who had proven themselves in the most demanding circumstances imaginable. It wasn't necessarily malicious, it was simply the natural order of a meritocracy, where performance under pressure determined one's place in the hierarchy. What Thompson and his colleagues didn't know was that Ford had been listening. Her desk was positioned just close enough to their usual gathering spot near the coffee machine to overhear their conversations, and she had developed the habit of paying attention to the informal intelligence that flowed through such discussions. She filed their comments away without reaction, her expression remaining neutral as she continued her work. Ford's daily routine was methodical and predictable. She arrived at 0630, 30 minutes before her official start time, and used those extra minutes to review the day's priorities and ensure that any urgent requests from the previous evening had been addressed. She took her lunch at her desk more often than not, claiming she preferred to stay caught up on paperwork rather than deal with the social dynamics of the mess hall. Her interactions with the SEALs who came through her office were professional but minimal. She provided what they needed efficiently and without unnecessary conversation. To the casual observer, Ford seemed to embody everything the SEAL community generally viewed with skepticism: risk aversion, preference for routine over chaos, comfort with bureaucracy rather than direct action. She represented the vast administrative apparatus that supported their operations but never shared their risks, the safely distant logistics personnel, who ensured they had bullets and beans but never had to fire the former or survive on the latter in hostile territory. But there were subtle signs that suggested Ford's story might be more complex than her quiet demeanor indicated. Senior Chief Petty Officer David Martinez, a 20-year veteran and one of the most respected instructors at the compound, had noticed them almost immediately. The way Ford carried herself when she thought no one was watching, a alertness that seemed inconsistent with someone whose most dangerous daily activity was navigating paperwork. The casual way she assessed exits and sightlines when entering a new room, as if tactical awareness had become second nature. The fact that she never seemed startled by the sudden loud noises that were common around a military training facility, as if her nervous system had been conditioned to process such stimuli differently than most people. Martinez had served alongside enough different types of operators to recognize that there were many ways to be dangerous, many paths to developing the kind of situational awareness that Ford displayed. But he also understood the value of allowing people to reveal themselves in their own time, particularly in an environment where premature assumptions could be costly. Ford's work performance was exemplary from the beginning. Requisitions that had previously taken days to process were completed within hours. Training schedules that had been sources of constant conflict between different teams were suddenly running smoothly. Equipment that had been perpetually in short supply began appearing with reliable consistency. She seemed to possess an intuitive understanding of the operational tempo and requirements of the teams, anticipating needs before they were articulated and finding solutions to logistical problems that had persisted for months. "She's good at her job," Morrison admitted to Thompson after Ford had somehow managed to procure a piece of specialized communications equipment that had been backordered for 6 weeks. "I'll give her that." Thompson nodded grudgingly. "Still doesn't mean she belongs here. This isn't accounting school. We need people who understand what it's like when things go sideways." It was a common sentiment in the special operations community, the belief that truly understanding their world required having experienced its unique pressures firsthand. There was some validity to this perspective. The difference between theoretical knowledge and experiential wisdom could indeed be measured in lives saved or lost, but it also created a form of gatekeeping that sometimes excluded people whose contributions might be valuable in ways that weren't immediately obvious. Ford seemed to understand this dynamic without taking offense at it. She went about her duties with quiet professionalism, neither seeking approval nor defending herself against implied criticism. When SEALs made jokes about office workers within her hearing, she didn't react. When they questioned her decisions or second-guessed her recommendations, she provided additional information without defensiveness. Her approach was so consistently even-tempered that it began to generate its own form of curiosity among those who interacted with her regularly. Petty Officer Second Class Amanda Hayes, one of the few other women assigned to the compound, had tried to engage Ford in conversation during her second week. Hayes worked in intelligence support and understood something about being evaluated differently because of her gender in a predominantly male environment. "How are you settling in?" Hayes had asked during a brief encounter near the copy machine. "Fine, thank you," Ford had replied politely but without elaboration. "It can take some time to find your rhythm here. The guys can be intense." Ford had looked at her directly for a moment, and Hayes had been struck by something in her eyes. Not nervousness or insecurity, but a kind of patient assessment, as if Ford was deciding how much truth the moment could handle. "They seem professional enough," Ford had said finally, her tone neutral. "Everyone has their own way of determining where someone fits." It wasn't much of a conversation, but Hayes had walked away with the impression that Ford understood far more about the social dynamics of the compound than her quiet demeanor suggested. There was something almost tactical about her approach to interpersonal relationships, measured, deliberate, designed to achieve specific objectives without unnecessary exposure. As Ford's third week began, the subtle patterns of life at Little Creek had begun to incorporate her presence as a known quantity. She was the logistics coordinator who got things done efficiently and without drama. She was the quiet professional who stayed in her lane and didn't cause problems. She was, in the minds of most of the SEALs who interacted with her, exactly what she appeared to be: competent but unremarkable, useful but not particularly interesting. It was an assessment that was about to be tested in ways none of them could have imagined. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The incident that would escalate everything began on a Tuesday morning when Petty Officer Chen discovered a discrepancy in the ammunition inventory. 3 cases of 5.56 rounds were showing as delivered but couldn't be located in the armory. In the civilian world, this might have warranted a stern email and some paperwork. In the special warfare community, missing ammunition was the kind of problem that could end careers and trigger investigations that no one wanted to endure. Chen had been tasked with preparing for an upcoming training exercise that required precise ammunition counts for safety and accountability purposes. The missing cases represented not just a logistical problem, but a potential security breach that would need to be reported up the chain of command if not resolved quickly. His initial reaction was frustration, followed quickly by the kind of focused anger that came from having his professional competence questioned by circumstances beyond his control. "Ford!" Chen's voice carried across the administrative office with an edge that made several people look up from their work. "We need to talk about your inventory management." Susanna Ford looked up from her computer screen, her fingers pausing over the keyboard. She had been working on a complex scheduling matrix that coordinated training resources across 4 different SEAL teams, the kind of 3-dimensional logistics puzzle that required constant attention to changing variables. The interruption was unwelcome, but her expression remained neutral as she saved her work and turned to face Chen. "What seems to be the problem, Petty Officer?" she asked, her voice maintaining the professional courtesy that had characterized all their previous interactions. Chen approached her desk with the swagger of someone accustomed to having his concerns taken seriously. At 26, he had already completed 2 combat deployments and earned a reputation for technical expertise that made his opinions carry weight within the community. He wasn't naturally cruel, but he possessed the kind of casual confidence that could easily tip over into arrogance when dealing with people he perceived as less capable. 3 cases of 5.56 are missing from the armory, he announced, placing a printed inventory report on her desk with more force than necessary. "According to your records, they were delivered and signed for last Thursday. According to reality, they're nowhere to be found." Ford picked up the report and examined it carefully, her eyes tracking across the columns of numbers and dates, with the methodical attention of someone who understood that details mattered. Chen watched her with growing impatience, interpreting her careful review as evidence that she was either incompetent or trying to cover up a mistake. "I remember this shipment," Ford said after a moment. "The delivery was unusual because the regular driver was sick, and they sent someone new. He didn't follow standard protocol for the armory delivery." "What kind of protocol?" Chen demanded, his tone suggesting that he expected her answer to reveal the source of the problem. "The new driver unloaded everything at the general receiving dock instead of taking ammunition directly to the armory. I had to coordinate with Master Chief Peterson to get it moved, but there was a delay because of the safety inspection that was happening in Building 7. Chen's expression shifted slightly as Ford's explanation revealed a level of specific knowledge about the delivery process that he hadn't expected. Most logistics personnel he'd dealt with would have simply checked their computer records and declared the problem someone else's responsibility. Ford, however, was providing details that suggested she had been personally involved in managing the complications that arose. "So where is it now?" Chen asked, his tone still aggressive but with a hint of uncertainty creeping in. "Master Chief Peterson had it secured in the temporary holding area behind Building 12 while the safety inspection was completed," Ford replied. "It should have been moved to the armory on Friday, but the inspection ran long and Peterson didn't want to risk having ammunition in transit during the weekend duty rotation." Chen felt a flush of embarrassment as he realized that Ford's explanation was not only plausible but demonstrated a level of attention to operational security that exceeded what he had expected from someone in her position. The temporary holding area behind Building 12 was a secure location used for exactly the kind of situation Ford was describing, and Master Chief Peterson was known for his cautious approach to ammunition handling. Why wasn't this documented in the system? Chen asked, grasping for some way to maintain his position of authority in the interaction. It was, Ford replied, turning to her computer and pulling up a screen that showed a detailed log of the ammunition's location and status. The entries are coded under the temporary holding protocol. Most people don't check that category unless they're specifically looking for items in administrative hold. The computer screen clearly showed the information Chen had been looking for, complete with timestamps and authorization codes that confirmed Ford's account of events. Chen found himself in the uncomfortable position of having to acknowledge that his dramatic confrontation had been based on his own failure to check all the relevant databases before assuming someone else had made an error. But rather than simply apologizing and moving on, Chen's wounded pride drove him to escalate the situation in a way that would prove to be a critical mistake. Well, maybe if your system wasn't so complicated, people wouldn't have to play guessing games to find basic information, he said, his voice loud enough to attract the attention of everyone in the immediate area. Ford's expression didn't change, but something subtle shifted in her posture. Those who were watching closely might have noticed that she seemed to settle back in her chair slightly, as if unconsciously preparing for something unpleasant. The system is designed to track items through multiple security levels, she explained patiently. Ammunition requires additional protocols because of safety and accountability requirements. I'd be happy to show you how to access the different categories, if that would be helpful. It was a perfectly reasonable response, delivered without condescension or defensiveness. But Chen, already embarrassed by his mistake, and feeling the weight of curious stares from his colleagues, interpreted Ford's offer as a subtle insult to his intelligence. I don't need some desk jockey explaining to me how military logistics work, he snapped. Maybe if you spent less time hiding behind complicated computer systems, and more time actually coordinating with the people who have to use this stuff, we wouldn't have these problems. The office had grown noticeably quieter, as other personnel sensed the escalating tension. Petty Officer Morrison, who had been working at a nearby desk, looked up with interest. Chief Thompson, emerging from a meeting room down the hall, paused when he noticed the confrontation developing. Ford remained seated, her hands folded calmly in her lap. When she spoke, her voice was level and professional, but there was something in her tone that suggested depths of patience that Chen was rapidly exhausting. I understand you're frustrated, Petty Officer Chen. Missing ammunition is a serious concern, and you're right to want it resolved quickly. The items you're looking for are secure and accounted for. I can have them transferred to the armory within the hour, if that meets your timeline requirements. It was exactly the kind of response that should have de-escalated the situation. Ford was offering to solve Chen's problem immediately, while acknowledging his legitimate concerns about ammunition security. Any reasonable person would have accepted the offer and moved on to more productive activities. But Chen was no longer operating from a position of reason. His public confrontation with Ford had attracted an audience that included several of his peers, and backing down now would require admitting that he had been wrong about both the missing ammunition and Ford's competence. For someone whose identity was built on being right about technical matters, such an admission felt impossible. Maybe the problem is that we've got people in critical positions who think logistics is just about moving numbers around on a computer screen, Chen said, his voice carrying clearly across the office. Some of us actually understand what it means when equipment isn't where it's supposed to be. The implication was clear. Ford, as a non-combatant in an administrative role, couldn't possibly understand the real-world consequences of logistical failures the way that operators like Chen could. It was the kind of casual dismissiveness that reflected deeper assumptions about who belonged in the special warfare community and whose contributions really mattered. Ford stood up slowly, her movement drawing the attention of everyone watching the exchange. For the first time since Chen had begun his confrontation, she looked directly at him with an expression that seemed to be evaluating something important. You're absolutely right, Petty Officer, she said quietly. Equipment that isn't where it's supposed to be can have serious consequences. People can get hurt when systems fail. There was something in the way she said it that made Chen suddenly uncomfortable, though he couldn't articulate why. It was as if Ford was speaking from experience rather than theory, as if she had personal knowledge of what happened when logistics went wrong in dangerous places. But Chen was too committed to his position to recognize the warning signs. Instead of taking Ford's measured response as an opportunity to gracefully exit the confrontation, he pressed forward with the kind of aggressive confidence that had served him well in other contexts, but was about to prove disastrously inappropriate here. "Right," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "So maybe, next time you can make sure things are where they're supposed to be instead of hiding them in some secret database that nobody knows about." Chief Thompson, who had been listening to the exchange with growing interest, stepped forward. He had been looking for an opportunity to assess the new logistics coordinator more directly, and Chen's confrontation provided the perfect excuse to apply some pressure and see how Ford responded under stress. "Chen's got a point," Thompson said, his authority as a chief immediately shifting the dynamics of the situation. "We need people in support positions who understand that our tolerance for error is pretty much zero. When something goes wrong downrange, nobody cares about your filing system." Ford looked at Thompson with the same careful assessment she had given Chen, as if she was processing new information about the nature of the situation she found herself in. When she spoke, her voice remained calm, but there was a subtle change in her tone that suggested she understood exactly what kind of test she was being subjected to. "I understand the stakes, Chief," she said simply. "I'll make sure the ammunition is transferred immediately." It should have been the end of the confrontation. Ford had acknowledged Thompson's authority, agreed to solve the problem, and demonstrated that she could maintain professionalism under pressure. But Thompson, like Chen, saw her composed response as evidence of something that needed to be challenged rather than respected. The stage was set for an escalation that would reveal truths none of them were prepared to handle. What began as professional skepticism quickly transformed into something far more personal and vindictive. Over the following week, Chief Thompson and his circle of followers launched what could only be described as a systematic campaign designed to test Ford's limits and expose what they believed to be her fundamental unsuitability for the special warfare environment. The harassment started subtly, with the kind of calculated psychological pressure that experienced operators knew how to apply without crossing obvious lines that might trigger formal complaints. Thompson had spent years learning how to push people to their breaking points as part of his training responsibilities, and he brought that expertise to bear on Ford with methodical precision. It began with deliberate disruptions to her work routine. Requisitions that should have been submitted through normal channels were instead hand-delivered at the last possible moment, creating artificial crises that required Ford to scramble to meet impossible deadlines. Training schedules were changed without notice, forcing her to coordinate with multiple departments under extreme time pressure. Equipment requests were submitted with deliberately vague specifications, then criticized when the delivered items didn't match unstated expectations. Ford responded to each challenge with the same steady professionalism she had displayed from the beginning, working longer hours and finding creative solutions to problems that had been designed to have no good answers. Her competence under pressure only seemed to irritate Thompson more, as if her ability to handle the manufactured crises proved that the tests weren't difficult enough. Petty Officer Hayes watched the escalating harassment with growing concern. As one of the few women on the compound, she recognized the particular dynamics at play when a group of aggressive men decided to target someone they perceived as vulnerable. She had seen similar patterns before, though rarely executed with the kind of systematic precision that Thompson was bringing to his campaign against Ford. "They're really going after her," Hayes mentioned to Senior Chief Martinez during a brief encounter in the mess hall. "It's getting pretty ugly." Martinez nodded grimly. He had been observing the situation with the kind of professional interest that came from 20 years of managing personnel conflicts in high-stress environments. What troubled him wasn't just the harassment itself, but the way Ford was handling it. Her responses suggested a level of psychological resilience that seemed inconsistent with someone who had never faced serious adversity. "She's not breaking the way they expect," Martinez observed. "That's making them push harder." It was an accurate assessment. Thompson had expected Ford to crack under relatively mild pressure, to reveal herself as the weak link he believed her to be. Instead, she continued to perform her duties with machine-like efficiency, absorbing each new challenge without complaint or visible distress. Her composure was beginning to feel like a personal insult to Thompson's ability to assess and break down personnel under stress. The campaign escalated when Thompson began incorporating Ford into the informal hazing rituals that were part of life at the compound. During equipment inspections, he would deliberately find fault with items that Ford had processed, questioning her attention to detail in front of groups of junior personnel. He started requiring her to attend briefings where her presence wasn't necessary, then asking her technical questions designed to expose the limitations of her knowledge about combat operations. "Ford," Thompson called out during one such briefing, his voice cutting across the room with theatrical authority. "You've been managing our communications equipment requests. What's your assessment of the ANPRC 152 reliability in high-humidity environments?" It was the kind of question designed to embarrass someone whose job was administrative rather than operational. The AN/PRC 152 was a sophisticated piece of communications equipment that most logistics personnel would know only from manufacturer specifications and maintenance manuals. Thompson expected Ford to stumble through some generic response that would demonstrate her lack of real-world experience with the gear she was responsible for managing. Instead, Ford answered with specific technical details about moisture infiltration problems in tropical environments, recommended modifications to antenna configurations for improved performance, and mentioned a firmware update that addressed connectivity issues that most users never knew existed. Her response was delivered in the same calm, professional tone she used for everything else, but the technical accuracy of her answer left Thompson momentarily speechless. "Where did you learn that?" Chen asked, his voice betraying genuine curiosity, despite his general hostility toward Ford. "Equipment familiarization is part of effective logistics management," Ford replied neutrally. "It's difficult to properly support gear you don't understand." It was a reasonable answer, but it raised more questions than it answered. Ford's knowledge went beyond what could be learned from manuals or training courses. She spoke about the equipment with the kind of practical understanding that came from extensive hands-on experience, the sort of familiarity that took years to develop through regular field use. Thompson recovered quickly from his surprise and decided to push harder. If Ford wanted to play the role of technical expert, he would test her knowledge in ways that would reveal the limits of her theoretical understanding. "Interesting," he said, his tone suggesting that Ford's competent answer had somehow confirmed his suspicions rather than challenged them. "Tell me, what kind of field experience gives a logistics coordinator that level of familiarity with special operations communications gear?" It was a loaded question, designed to either force Ford to admit that her knowledge was purely academic, or to claim field experience that Thompson could then challenge and discredit. The room fell silent, as everyone waited for Ford's response, sensing that the exchange had moved beyond routine hazing into more dangerous territory. Ford looked at Thompson directly, and for a moment something flickered in her expression that made several of the more experienced personnel in the room shift uncomfortably. It was the briefest glimpse of something that didn't match her quiet administrative persona, something that suggested depths of experience that her current role didn't account for. "I make it a point to thoroughly understand any equipment I'm responsible for managing," she said finally, her voice carrying a subtle warning that Thompson was too focused on his own agenda to recognize. "Incomplete knowledge leads to poor decisions." The answer sidestepped Thompson's trap, while delivering what could have been interpreted as gentle criticism of his own approach to the situation. But Thompson was beyond the point where subtle warnings could penetrate his determination to expose what he saw as Ford's fundamental inadequacy for her position. Over the next several days, the harassment intensified. Thompson began assigning Ford to duties that were technically within her job description, but clearly designed to humiliate and exhaust her. She was required to personally inventory equipment in remote storage areas during off hours. She was tasked with coordinating training exercises that required her to work directly with SEAL teams who had been briefed to view her as an obstacle to their operational effectiveness. The psychological pressure was relentless and professionally executed. Thompson was careful to frame each new requirement as legitimate military necessity, making it difficult for Ford to object without appearing insubordinate. He was creating a situation where her only option seemed to be enduring escalating abuse or requesting a transfer that would essentially confirm his assessment of her unsuitability. Ford's response to the intensifying campaign was to work even harder. She arrived earlier, stayed later, and approached each new challenge with the same methodical professionalism that had characterized her work from the beginning. Her performance under pressure was so consistent that it began to generate a different kind of attention from some of the more observant personnel on the compound. Senior Chief Martinez wasn't the only one who had begun to notice that Ford's reactions to stress seemed inconsistent with someone whose toughest previous challenge had been managing supply chains in peaceful environments. Her psychological resilience was too complete, too practiced. She moved through Thompson's harassment campaign like someone who had faced far worse challenges and survived them. But the most telling sign was what happened when Ford thought no one was watching. Hayes had observed her during quiet moments between the manufactured crises, and what she saw was troubling. Ford didn't show the signs of someone being gradually worn down by systematic abuse. Instead, there was something in her posture and expression that suggested she was evaluating the situation with the kind of tactical awareness that most people never developed. The breaking point was approaching, though Thompson remained oblivious to the warning signs that others were beginning to recognize. He was so focused on proving Ford's weakness that he failed to consider the possibility that her strength might be the problem he should be worried about. His next escalation would force answers to questions that nobody was prepared to handle. The incident that would shatter everything began on a Friday evening when most of the compound's personnel had already departed for weekend liberty. Ford had remained behind to complete an urgent equipment audit that Thompson had assigned with only 4 hours' notice, claiming it was required for a Monday morning briefing with the base commander. The timing was no coincidence. Thompson had specifically chosen a task that would force Ford to work alone in the equipment storage facility while the compound was largely deserted. The storage facility was located in Building 18, a converted warehouse that housed everything from diving gear to advanced electronics. Its isolation from the main administrative areas made it perfect for Thompson's purposes. He had spent the afternoon coordinating with his most reliable followers, Chen, Morrison, and 2 newer arrivals, Petty Officers Kevin Walsh and Danny Rodriguez, to ensure they would all have reasons to be in the area after normal duty hours. Ford had been working methodically through the inventory for nearly 3 hours when she heard footsteps approaching across the concrete floor. The acoustics of the large space made it impossible to mistake the sound of multiple people moving with deliberate coordination rather than casual purpose. She looked up from her clipboard to see Thompson and his 4 companions approaching in a loose formation that blocked her most direct path to the exit. "Working late again, Ford?" Thompson called out, his voice echoing off the metal walls with false cheerfulness. "You really need to learn how to manage your time better." Ford set down her clipboard and straightened, her body language shifting subtly as she assessed the situation developing around her. The 5 men were positioning themselves with the kind of tactical awareness that suggested this encounter had been planned rather than accidental. Their body language radiated aggressive confidence, the swagger of predators who believed they had cornered suitable prey. "Just finishing the audit you requested, Chief," Ford replied, her voice maintaining its characteristic calm despite the obvious threat implicit in their formation. "I should have it completed within the hour." "See, that's the problem right there," Thompson said, moving closer while his companions maintained their positions. "You're always so focused on the paperwork that you never seem to understand what's really going on around here." Morrison stepped forward from Ford's left flank, his voice carrying the kind of casual cruelty that some people mistake for humor. "Maybe it's time somebody explained to you how things really work in the teams." The threat was becoming explicit now, though still wrapped in the kind of language that could be defended as aggressive mentoring if anyone later questioned what had happened. Ford's eyes moved systematically from one man to another, her gaze lingering just long enough on each face to register details that would be useful if she needed to identify them later. Her apparent calm was beginning to unnerve some of the participants, though their commitment to Thompson's leadership kept them moving forward with the planned confrontation. "I appreciate the concern," Ford said, taking a step backward that positioned her closer to a stack of equipment crates that could provide cover if the situation deteriorated further. "But I think I understand the expectations for my position." Chen laughed harshly, the sound echoing unpleasantly in the enclosed space. "Your position? Lady, you don't even understand what position you're in right now." Walsh, who had been largely silent during the approach, seemed to be having second thoughts about the wisdom of their current course of action. He was newer to the compound than the others, and less confident about the informal rules that governed how far such confrontations could be pushed. Maybe we should just... Maybe you should shut up and let the grown-ups handle this, Thompson interrupted, his tone making it clear that dissent from his followers would not be tolerated. He turned his attention back to Ford, stepping closer until he was well within her personal space. You know what I think? I think you've been playing games with us. Acting all quiet and professional while you look down on the people who actually do the real work around here. Ford didn't retreat from Thompson's aggressive proximity, though the tension in her posture suggested she was prepared to respond instantly if the situation turned physical. When she spoke, her voice carried a warning that only the most experienced personnel would have recognized. I don't look down on anyone, Chief. I respect the work that everyone here does. Respect? Thompson's voice rose with theatrical incredulity. You want to talk about respect? Let me tell you something about respect. It's earned through shared hardship. It comes from proving you can handle the same risks and pressures as everyone else. What have you ever risked? What have you ever sacrificed? It was the culmination of weeks of building frustration, Thompson's core belief that Ford's administrative role disqualified her from the respect accorded to combat veterans. His voice carried the righteous anger of someone who had survived genuine dangers and resented having to treat as equals those who had not shared similar experiences. Ford looked at Thompson with an expression that was becoming increasingly difficult to read. The careful neutrality that had characterized her interactions with the SEALs was giving way to something that made the more perceptive members of his group suddenly uncomfortable. You're right, she said quietly. Respect is earned through shared hardship. There was something in the way she said it that suggested she understood the concept far better than Thompson had expected, but he was too committed to his course of action to recognize the subtle warning in her tone. Exactly, Thompson said, misinterpreting Ford's agreement as submission. So maybe it's time you learned what real pressure feels like. Maybe you need to understand what happens when the safety net gets pulled away. Morrison, emboldened by what he perceived as Thompson's dominance of the situation, stepped closer to Ford's right side. Strip down, he said suddenly, his voice thick with anticipation. Let's see what's under all those long sleeves. Time to stop hiding behind your paperwork and show us what you're really made of. The demand hung in the air, like a physical presence, its implications clear to everyone present. What had begun as psychological harassment was crossing into territory that could not be defended as legitimate military discipline. Walsh took a visible step backward, his discomfort with the escalation overriding his loyalty to the group dynamic. Ford's response was immediate and decisive. In a voice that carried absolute authority despite its quiet tone, she said no. The single word seemed to reverberate in the enclosed space with unexpected power. It wasn't the frightened refusal of someone being victimized, but the calm declaration of someone who had faced far worse threats and survived them. For the first time since the confrontation began, Thompson felt a flicker of uncertainty about the wisdom of his chosen course of action. But Chen, interpreting Ford's refusal as weakness rather than strength, moved to grab her arm. I don't think you understand, he said, reaching for the sleeve of her uniform shirt. This isn't a request. What happened next would be seared into the memories of everyone present for the rest of their lives. As Chen's hand made contact with Ford's sleeve, she moved with a speed and precision that revealed training far beyond anything an administrative specialist should have possessed. Her response was not the panicked flailing of someone being assaulted, but the controlled violence of someone who had been trained to kill and had done so under circumstances none of them could imagine. Chen found himself on the concrete floor before he fully understood how he had gotten there, his arm twisted at an angle that suggested Ford could have broken it without apparent effort. The takedown had been executed with such clinical efficiency that it took the other men several seconds to process what they had witnessed. I said no, Ford repeated, her voice carrying a different quality now, something that made the hair on the back of Thompson's neck stand up. She released Chen's arm and stepped back, her hands held in a ready position that suggested she was prepared for whatever came next. The storage facility fell silent except for Chen's labored breathing as he struggled to process both the physical shock of the takedown and the implications of Ford's unexpected capabilities. Thompson stared at her with a mixture of confusion and growing alarm, finally beginning to understand that his assessment of the situation had been catastrophically wrong. Ford looked at each of them in turn, her gaze carrying a weight that none of them had felt before. When she spoke, her voice was calm, but carried undertones that suggested vast depths of experience with violence that they were only beginning to glimpse. "I think this conversation is over," she said quietly. "I suggest you all think very carefully about what happens next." The warning was delivered without theatrics or raised voices, but its impact was immediate and profound. Even Thompson, despite his years of combat experience, felt something cold settle in his stomach as he realized that he had badly misjudged both Ford's capabilities and the nature of the situation he had created. The revelation of Ford's true nature was about to begin, and none of them were prepared for what they would learn. The silence in the storage facility stretched for what felt like an eternity, broken only by Chen's ragged breathing as he slowly pulled himself to his feet. His face was flushed with a mixture of pain and humiliation, his confidence shattered by the casual efficiency with which Ford had neutralized his assault. The other men stood frozen, their minds struggling to reconcile what they had just witnessed with their preconceived notions about the quiet logistics coordinator they thought they knew. Thompson's tactical mind was racing through possibilities, trying to understand how someone in Ford's position could have executed such a flawless defensive maneuver. The takedown had been textbook special operations technique, precise, controlled, and devastatingly effective. It wasn't something that could be learned from a weekend self-defense course or picked up through casual training. It was the kind of muscle memory that came from years of intensive combat instruction and real-world application. "What the hell are you?" Thompson asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The swagger and aggressive confidence that had driven him to engineer this confrontation had evaporated, replaced by the wary respect of a predator who had suddenly realized he might be facing an apex predator. So, Ford looked at him with an expression that seemed to be evaluating how much truth the moment could handle. Her posture had changed subtly since Chen's failed assault. She no longer carried herself like someone trying to blend into the administrative background. The careful camouflage of bureaucratic invisibility had been stripped away, revealing something that made even these hardened SEALs instinctively cautious. "I'm exactly who I've always said I am," Ford replied, her voice carrying undertones that suggested layers of meaning none of them fully understood. Petty Officer Second Class Susanna Ford, Logistics Coordination Specialist. Morrison, who had been silent since witnessing Chen's humiliation, finally found his voice. "Bullshit. Nobody learns to fight like that pushing paperwork in the rear echelon." Ford's gaze shifted to Morrison with a kind of clinical assessment that made him wish he had remained silent. "You're right," she said simply, "they don't." The admission hung in the air like a challenge, daring them to pursue questions they were increasingly uncertain they wanted answered. Walsh, who had been edging toward the exit since the situation turned violent, spoke up with barely controlled nervousness. "Maybe we should all just walk away from this," he suggested, his voice tight with anxiety. "Nobody needs to know what happened here." Thompson turned on him with the kind of fury that came from having his authority questioned at the worst possible moment. "Nobody's walking away from anything until we get some answers," he snarled. "I want to know who we're really dealing with here." It was a demand born of wounded pride rather than tactical wisdom, the reaction of someone who couldn't accept that his careful psychological campaign had been built on completely false assumptions. Thompson had spent weeks systematically humiliating Ford based on his assessment of her as weak and inexperienced. The revelation that she possessed skills that potentially exceeded his own was a challenge to his fundamental understanding of his place in the military hierarchy. Ford studied Thompson's face with the kind of patient attention that suggested she was making important decisions about how to proceed. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight that none of them had heard before. "Chief Thompson, you've made it very clear that you believe respect must be earned through shared hardship. You've questioned my qualifications, my competence, and my right to serve alongside people who have faced real danger." She paused, seeming to consider her next words carefully. "Perhaps it's time you understood exactly what kind of hardship I've shared." Without breaking eye contact with Thompson, Ford reached for the buttons of her uniform shirt. The gesture was deliberate and controlled. Nothing like the forced exposure they had attempted to inflict on her moments earlier. This was her choice, her revelation delivered on her terms rather than theirs. "You wanted to see what was under the long sleeves," she said quietly. "You wanted to understand where someone like me fits in your world of warriors and heroes." Thompson felt his mouth go dry as Ford systematically unbuttoned her shirt, her movements precise and unhurried. There was something ritualistic about the gesture, as if she was preparing to reveal truths that would fundamentally alter everyone's understanding of the situation. When Ford pulled her shirt open and let it fall to her waist, the collective intake of breath from the 5 men was audible in the enclosed space. Her torso was a roadmap of violence that told stories more horrific than any of them had imagined possible. The scars that had been hidden beneath her carefully maintained uniform weren't the random marks of accidents or training mishaps. They were the systematic evidence of professional torture. Burn marks in precise patterns covered her ribs and abdomen, the kind of deliberate scarification that spoke of interrogation techniques designed to inflict maximum pain without causing death. Knife wounds formed geometric patterns across her back and shoulders, some clearly the result of sustained cutting over extended periods. Most shocking of all were the unmistakable marks of electrical torture, spiderweb patterns of scarred tissue that could only have been created by repeated application of high-voltage current over days or weeks. Chin, still struggling to process his own humiliation, stared at Ford's exposed torso with horror. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, "what happened to you?" Ford's expression didn't change as she surveyed their shocked faces. "I was captured during a classified operation in Somalia 3 years ago," she said, her voice carrying the flat affect of someone recounting events that had been processed through extensive psychological debriefing. "Al-Shabaab held me for 47 days while they tried to extract information about NATO's special operations capabilities in the Horn of Africa." Morrison felt his legs go weak as the implications of Ford's revelation crashed over him. "Your special operations," he said, his voice barely audible. "I was," Ford corrected, "before my cover was blown and I became a liability to ongoing operations in the region." Thompson's mind was reeling as he tried to reconcile this new information with everything he thought he knew about Ford's background. "What unit?" he asked, though part of him was already afraid of the answer. Ford looked at him with something that might have been pity. "DEV GRU," she said simply. The acronym hit the 5 men like a physical blow. DEV GRU, the Naval Special Warfare Development Group, more commonly known as SEAL Team 6. The most elite unit in the most elite branch of American Special Operations, the organization that handled the missions too sensitive and dangerous for anyone else. Ford wasn't just Special Operations. She was the absolute pinnacle of American military capability. "You're lying," Chin said desperately, though his voice betrayed his growing certainty that she wasn't. "Women aren't allowed in DEV GRU." Ford's smile was cold and humorless. "Officially, you're correct. Officially, there has never been a female operator assigned to DEV GRU. Officially, Petty Officer Susanna Ford has spent her entire career in logistics and administrative roles." The careful emphasis on the word "officially" made it clear that Ford's actual career bore little resemblance to what appeared in any personnel file they might have access to. She was describing the kind of deep cover assignment that existed in the shadows between official military doctrine and operational necessity. Rodriguez, who had been silent throughout the confrontation, finally found his voice. "The torture scars. How did you survive something like that?" Ford began buttoning her shirt with the same methodical precision she had shown in removing it. "The same way anyone survives," she said matter-of-factly. "You endure what you have to endure, and you never give them what they want." Thompson felt the full weight of his catastrophic misjudgment settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. He had spent weeks psychologically torturing someone who had already survived horrors that exceeded his worst nightmares. He had questioned the courage and competence of someone whose classified service record probably contained operations that would never be publicly acknowledged. "The rescue?" Morrison asked, his voice hoarse with shock. "Day 48, Ford replied, smoothing her uniform back into regulation appearance. "Joint Task Force operation involving assets from multiple countries. 17 enemy combatants eliminated. No friendly casualties." She paused, looking at each of them in turn with an expression that suggested she was cataloging their faces for future reference. "The psychological evaluation recommended administrative assignment while I completed the transition back to normal operations tempo," she continued. "Logistics coordination was suggested as a low-stress environment that would allow for gradual reintegration into military structure." The irony was devastating. Ford had been assigned to their compound specifically because it was supposed to be a safe, supportive environment where she could recover from trauma that would have broken most people completely. Instead, Thompson and his followers had recreated the conditions of psychological torture that Ford had endured at the hands of enemy combatants. Walsh, who had been backing toward the exit throughout Ford's revelation, finally reached the doorway. "I'm sorry," he stammered. "I'm so sorry, I didn't know." Ford looked at him with something that might have been understanding. "None of you knew," she said quietly. "That was the point." The storage facility fell silent again as the full implications of Ford's identity settled over them. They had discovered that their quiet logistics coordinator was not only a decorated combat veteran, but one of the most elite operators in the American military. More than that, she was someone who had endured and survived torture that would have broken most people, then chosen to continue serving her country in whatever capacity she was assigned. Thompson realized that his campaign of harassment hadn't revealed Ford's weakness. It had demonstrated a strength that exceeded anything he had ever encountered. The breaking point he had been pushing toward wasn't hers. It was his own. The weight of Ford's revelation settled over the storage facility like a suffocating blanket. Thompson stood frozen, his mind struggling to process the magnitude of his error. Every interaction he'd had with Ford over the past month was being rewritten in his memory. Each moment of casual cruelty now revealed as an unconscionable assault on someone who had already sacrificed more for their country than most people could comprehend. Chen had gone completely pale, his earlier bravado evaporated as he realized he had physically assaulted a decorated DevGRU operator. The hand that had grabbed Ford's sleeve was now trembling as the full implications of his actions crashed over him. He had attacked someone whose classified service record likely contained operations that would never see the light of day, missions that had shaped the course of international conflicts in ways the public would never know. "Ma'am," Morrison said suddenly, his voice cracking as he snapped to attention with parade-ground precision. The automatic respect was instinctive, the response of a professional soldier who had finally recognized the presence of someone whose service exceeded his own by orders of magnitude. Ford observed Morrison's gesture with an expression that was difficult to read. There was no satisfaction in her eyes, no vindication at finally receiving the recognition she had earned through blood and sacrifice. Instead, there was something that looked almost like sadness, as if she had hoped to avoid this moment of truth indefinitely. "At ease," she said quietly, though Morrison remained rigidly upright. "I'm not here as a DEEE BOIGU operator. I'm here as Petty Officer Ford, Logistics Coordinator. That's all I want to be." Thompson found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "The psychological evaluation, the administrative assignment, we've been—" He couldn't finish the sentence, unable to articulate the full horror of what they had done. "You've been doing exactly what you thought was appropriate," Ford replied, her tone carrying neither accusation nor absolution. "Based on the information available to you, your assessment was reasonable. You saw someone in an administrative role who seemed unprepared for the realities of special operations culture." Her words were meant to be merciful, but they only made Thompson feel worse. Ford was offering him an excuse for behavior that had no excuse, trying to minimize the psychological torture she had endured at the hands of people who should have been her brothers in arms. Rodriguez, who had been silent throughout most of the confrontation, stepped forward with tears streaming down his face. "Ma'am, I need to apologize. What we did, what I participated in, there's no excuse for it." Ford looked at him with something that might have been understanding. "Petty Officer Rodriguez, you're young and you were following the lead of senior personnel. The military teaches us to trust the judgment of our leaders, even when that judgment proves to be flawed." But Thompson knew that Ford's attempt at absolution couldn't erase the reality of what had happened. He had led a campaign of systematic harassment against someone who had already endured professional torture at the hands of enemy combatants. He had questioned the courage of someone whose bravery had been tested in ways that exceeded his worst nightmares. "The burns," Chen said suddenly, his voice hollow with horror. "The electrical marks, how long did they—" 47 days, Ford replied matter-of-factly. "They were very systematic, very professional. They had clearly received training in advanced interrogation techniques." The clinical way she described her torture was somehow more devastating than emotional testimony would have been. Ford spoke about her ordeal with the detached professionalism of someone briefing colleagues on enemy capabilities, as if the systematic destruction of her body had been just another aspect of operational reality to be endured and overcome. Walsh, who had been edging toward the exit, finally broke completely. I can't deal with this. he stammered, before turning and running from the storage facility. His footsteps echoed through the building as he fled, unable to face the magnitude of what he had participated in. Thompson watched Walsh's retreat with a mixture of understanding and contempt. Part of him wanted to follow, to escape the crushing weight of guilt that Ford's revelation had unleashed. But he was a chief petty officer, a leader who had made catastrophic decisions, and running away wouldn't change the consequences of his actions. "What happens now?" Morrison asked, his voice barely audible. Ford considered the question with the same careful deliberation she brought to all her responses. "Now you know who I really am," she said simply. "The question is, what you choose to do with that knowledge." Thompson felt the full implications of her words settling over him. Ford wasn't just revealing her identity. She was placing an enormous burden of trust on people who had spent weeks proving they didn't deserve it. Her Devjazgayu background was almost certainly classified at levels that could result in serious legal consequences if mishandled. She was trusting them with secrets that could affect ongoing operations and endanger other personnel. "Why?" Thompson asked desperately. "Why are you telling us this? You could have just endured it, finished your assignment and moved on. Why risk exposing yourself?" Ford's expression softened slightly, revealing glimpses of the person behind the professional facade. "Because endurance has limits, Chief. I survived 47 days of professional torture by enemy combatants. I wasn't sure I could survive indefinite psychological harassment by my own people." The words hit Thompson like physical blows. Ford wasn't revealing her identity as a power play or an attempt to gain advantage. She was making a desperate attempt to end abuse that was threatening to break someone who had already been broken and rebuilt more times than anyone should have to endure. Chen, who had been silent since his failed assault, finally spoke up. "Ma'am, when you took me down, you could have seriously hurt me. You could have broken my arm. Or worse, why didn't you?" Ford looked at him with an expression that was both stern and understanding. "Because you're not the enemy, Petty Officer Chen. You're a fellow American service member who made a serious error in judgment. I don't hurt people on my own side unless I have absolutely no other choice." The moral clarity of her response was devastating. Even while being physically assaulted, Ford had maintained enough professional discipline to use only the minimum force necessary to protect herself. She had treated Chen with more restraint and mercy than he had shown her during weeks of psychological harassment. Morrison, who had remained at attention throughout the conversation, finally spoke up. "Ma'am, what can we do? How can we make this right?" Ford studied his face with the kind of assessment that suggested she was measuring his sincerity against her considerable experience with human nature under stress. When she replied, her voice carried the authority of someone who had commanded respect in the most dangerous places on earth. "You can start by understanding that I don't want special treatment," she said firmly. "I don't want deference or hero worship or people walking on eggshells around me. I came here to do a job, and I want to be allowed to do that job without harassment or interference." Thompson nodded slowly, beginning to understand the impossible position Ford had been placed in. Her extraordinary background made normal integration into military life nearly impossible. She was simultaneously overqualified for any administrative role and too valuable to risk in active operations. The psychological evaluation had recommended administrative assignment as a way to ease her transition back to normal life, but normal life was exactly what her background made impossible to achieve. "The classification level," Thompson said suddenly, realization dawning. "This conversation, what we've learned, it's all classified, isn't it?" Ford nodded grimly. "Dehipra Griyu operations are classified at levels that most personnel never encounter. My assignment here is part of a carefully constructed cover that allows me to serve while protecting operational security. What you've learned tonight could compromise ongoing missions and endanger active personnel if it were to be disclosed inappropriately." The full weight of responsibility was settling on Thompson's shoulders now. Not only had he led a campaign of harassment against a genuine war hero, but Ford's revelation had made him responsible for protecting secrets that could affect national security. She had trusted him with information that could destroy careers and compromise operations, trusting that his guilt and professional obligation would ensure his discretion. It was, Thompson realized, a masterful tactical maneuver. Ford had ended their harassment campaign not through appeals to authority or formal complaints, but by making them complicit in protecting her cover. They couldn't reveal what they had learned without exposing their own misconduct. and they couldn't continue their harassment without betraying secrets they were now duty-bound to protect. But more than tactical considerations, Thompson was beginning to understand the profound personal cost of Ford's revelation. She had been forced to expose traumas and experiences that she had hoped to keep private, sacrificing her own psychological comfort to end abuse that threatened her ability to function. The storage facility fell silent as each man contemplated the magnitude of their collective failure and the impossible burden Ford had carried with such quiet dignity. They had discovered that their assumptions about strength and weakness, about who deserved respect and who could be safely dismissed, had been catastrophically wrong. The reckoning was just beginning. The silence in the storage facility had become unbearable, heavy with the weight of unspoken truths and the magnitude of irreversible actions. Thompson stood paralyzed by the crushing realization that he had not only failed as a leader, but had actively participated in the psychological destruction of someone whose service to their country exceeded anything he had ever imagined possible. Ford had finished adjusting her uniform and stood quietly, watching the 4 remaining men process the reality of what they had learned. Her expression was unreadable, but there was something in her posture that suggested she was waiting for them to reach some kind of decision about how to move forward from this moment of devastating truth. Chen was the first to break. The same aggressive confidence that had driven him to physically assault Ford now crumbled under the weight of understanding who he had actually attacked. His legs gave out beneath him, and he dropped to his knees on the concrete floor, his body shaking with the horror of his actions. "Ma'am," he said, his voice breaking with emotion, "I put my hands on you. I tried to. I attacked a Diubgru operator who survived 47 days of torture. I attacked someone who sacrificed everything for this country, and I did it because I thought you were weak." Ford looked down at Chen with an expression that was difficult to interpret. There was no satisfaction in her eyes at seeing her tormentor brought low, no sense of vindication or justice being served. Instead, there was something that looked almost like sadness, as if she had hoped to avoid this moment of complete revelation and its inevitable consequences. "Petty Officer Chen," she said quietly, "you attacked someone you perceived as unable to defend herself. The fact that your perception was wrong doesn't change the intent behind your actions." Her words were precise and devastating, cutting through any potential excuse or rationalization that Chen might have constructed. She wasn't absolving him of responsibility, but she also wasn't condemning him with the fury he probably deserved. Her response was measured, professional, and somehow more damning than any emotional outburst would have been. Morrison, who had been struggling to maintain his composure throughout Ford's revelation, suddenly stepped forward and dropped to one knee beside Chen. The gesture was spontaneous and unplanned, driven by a combination of guilt, respect, and the desperate need to somehow acknowledge the magnitude of what Ford had endured. "Ma'am," Morrison said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I participated in psychological torture against someone who had already survived real torture. I questioned your courage when you've already proven your bravery in ways I can't even imagine. I don't know how to make that right, but I need you to know that I understand what we did was unforgivable." Rodriguez, tears still streaming down his face, joined his companions on the concrete floor. His younger age and relative inexperience made his participation in the harassment campaign somewhat more understandable. But his remorse was no less genuine for being influenced by his desire to fit in with senior personnel. "I followed them because I thought that's what I was supposed to do," he said, his voice thick with shame. "I thought harassment was just part of the culture, part of how we tested people. I never thought about what you might have already been through." Thompson stood alone among the kneeling men, his mind reeling with the implications of their collective action. The sight of 3 Navy SEALs kneeling before Ford was unprecedented, a breach of military protocol that reflected the extraordinary nature of their situation. They weren't just acknowledging her superior service record, they were performing an act of contrition that recognized the fundamental moral failure of their behavior. Ford looked at the 3 kneeling men with an expression that suggested she was struggling with emotions that her professional training had taught her to suppress. When she spoke, her voice carried undertones of exhaustion that went far beyond physical fatigue. "This isn't what I wanted," she said quietly. "I didn't reveal my background to humiliate you, or to receive apologies that can't change what happened. I told you who I am because I needed the harassment to stop." Thompson finally understood that Ford's revelation hadn't been about establishing dominance or proving her superiority. It had been a desperate tactical maneuver by someone who had reached the limits of her psychological endurance. She had sacrificed her carefully maintained cover not for personal vindication, but simply to end abuse that was threatening her ability to function. "Ma'am," Thompson said, his voice hoarse with shame, "I need to understand something. When you were captured in Somalia, when they tortured you for 47 days, did you break? Did you give them anything?" Ford looked at him with an expression that suggested she understood the deeper question behind his words. "No, Chief, I gave them nothing. Not operational details, not personnel information, not intelligence about ongoing missions. Nothing." Thompson felt his knees buckle as the full implication of her answer crashed over him. Ford had endured 47 days of professional torture by enemy combatants without breaking, without betraying her country or her fellow operators. She had maintained perfect operational security under conditions that would have broken most people within hours. And then she had come to Little Creek, supposedly to a safe administrative assignment where she could recover from her ordeal, only to face renewed psychological torture from her own people. The harassment campaign that Thompson had engineered was a continuation of the abuse Ford had already survived, inflicted by people who should have been providing support and protection. Thompson dropped to his knees beside his men, the weight of his moral failure finally forcing him to acknowledge the enormity of what they had done. "Ma'am," he said, his voice breaking, "I led a psychological torture campaign against a torture survivor. I question the loyalty and courage of someone who proved both under the worst possible circumstances. I have no excuse, no justification, no way to undo what I've done." Ford looked down at the 4 kneeling SEALs with an expression that was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. The professional facade that had protected her through weeks of harassment was finally beginning to crack, revealing glimpses of the human being behind the carefully constructed cover identity. "I need you all to understand something," she said, her voice carrying new undertones of vulnerability. "I didn't survive what I survived in Somalia just to be broken by my own people here. I've given everything I had to this country, including parts of myself that I'll never get back. All I wanted was to serve quietly, to do my job, and to be left alone to heal from things that you can't see and don't understand." The storage facility fell silent again as Ford's words settled over the kneeling men. They had discovered that their quiet logistics coordinator wasn't just a decorated combat veteran or even an elite special operator. She was someone who had sacrificed so much for their shared mission that she had been fundamentally changed by the experience, someone who deserved not just respect but protection from the very people who had instead chosen to torment her. Chen raised his head to look at Ford directly, his face streaked with tears. "Ma'am, how do we live with this? How do we move forward knowing what we've done?" Ford considered his question with the same careful deliberation she brought to all her responses. When she answered, her voice carried the wisdom of someone who had faced moral complexities that most people never encountered. "You live with it by learning from it," she said simply. "You make sure it never happens again, to me or to anyone else. You remember that assumptions about people's backgrounds and capabilities can be catastrophically wrong. And you understand that strength comes in many forms, not all of which are immediately visible." Thompson looked up at Ford with an expression of desperate hope. "Is there any way, any possibility that you could forgive us? That we could somehow earn back even a fraction of the respect we threw away?" Ford's expression softened slightly, revealing more of the person behind the professional mask. "Chief Thompson, forgiveness isn't something you earn through dramatic gestures or public displays of remorse. It's something that develops over time through consistent actions and changed behavior." She paused, looking at each of the kneeling men in turn. "If you want my forgiveness, prove that you've learned something from this experience. Treat people with dignity regardless of their apparent position or background. Question your assumptions before you act on them. And remember that everyone you meet is fighting battles you know nothing about." The 4 SEALs remained on their knees, processing Ford's words and the long road ahead of them. They had discovered that redemption wasn't a moment of dramatic revelation, but a commitment to fundamental change that would be tested in countless small interactions over months and years to come. Ford had given them a path forward, but it would be up to them to walk it with the same dedication and courage that she had shown throughout her ordeal. 3 months had passed since that night in the storage facility, and the Naval Special Warfare Compound at Little Creek had undergone a transformation that was subtle but profound. The change wasn't visible in the physical infrastructure or the official operational procedures, but in the way people interacted with each other, the assumptions they made about their colleagues, and the respect they showed for those whose contributions might not be immediately obvious. Ford continued her duties as logistics coordinator with the same quiet efficiency that had characterized her work from the beginning, but the dynamic around her had fundamentally shifted. The casual dismissiveness that had once defined her interactions with the SEAL community had been replaced by something more complex, a respectful distance that acknowledged both her professional competence and her desire for privacy about her background. Thompson had kept his word about learning from the experience. His leadership style had evolved from aggressive dominance to something more thoughtful and inclusive. He still maintained the high standards that had made him an effective chief, but he approached personnel evaluations with a humility that reflected his hard-won understanding of how catastrophically wrong first impressions could be. The change was most visible in how he dealt with new personnel arriving at the compound. Where he had once relied on aggressive testing to separate the weak from the strong, he now took time to observe and understand before making judgments. His questions had become more thoughtful, his assessments more nuanced, and his willingness to admit uncertainty had actually increased rather than diminished his authority among his subordinates. Chen had perhaps undergone the most dramatic transformation. The cocky confidence that had driven him to physically assault Ford had been replaced by a careful mindfulness about consent and boundaries that extended far beyond military protocol. He had requested additional training on recognizing and preventing sexual harassment, becoming an unofficial advocate for respectful workplace behavior among the junior enlisted personnel. His technical expertise remained as sharp as ever, but he now applied it with an awareness of how knowledge could be shared, rather than wielded as a weapon of superiority. When new technicians arrived for training, Chen took time to understand their backgrounds and learning styles before determining how to most effectively transfer information. His teaching had become patient and inclusive, rather than competitive and dismissive. Morrison had channeled his remorse into a deep study of military history and ethics, trying to understand how good people could participate in systems that caused harm to those they were supposed to protect. He had become something of an informal counselor for personnel, dealing with difficult transitions, drawing on his own experience of moral failure and recovery to help others navigate complex situations. His communications expertise had expanded beyond technical systems to include an intuitive understanding of how information flowed through military communities and how rumors and assumptions could damage people who had no way to defend themselves. He had become a quiet but effective advocate for giving people the benefit of the doubt and asking questions before drawing conclusions. Rodriguez, the youngest of Ford's tormentors, had used the experience as a foundation for understanding the difference between following orders and exercising moral judgment. He had learned to distinguish between legitimate military discipline and abuse of authority, developing the courage to speak up when he witnessed behavior that crossed ethical lines. His youth, which had once made him susceptible to following negative examples, now made him an effective voice for change among his peer group. Other young SEALs listened to his perspectives on respect and professionalism because he spoke from authentic experience rather than theoretical knowledge. Walsh, who had fled the storage facility that night, had requested a transfer within weeks of Ford's revelation. Unable to face the daily reminder of his participation in tormenting a genuine war hero, he had sought assignment to a different command, where he could start fresh. His departure had been handled quietly, without official explanation, but his absence served as a reminder to the others of how moral failures could have lasting consequences. The most significant change, however, was in how the compound's personnel interacted with Ford herself. The elaborate deference that some had initially shown after learning her true background had gradually given way to something more sustainable, genuine professional respect that acknowledged her expertise without turning her into an object of worship or pity. Senior Chief Martinez, who had suspected Ford's true nature from the beginning, had become something of a protective presence without being intrusive. His 20 years of experience had taught him how to create space for people to heal from trauma while still maintaining operational effectiveness. He quietly managed situations that might put unnecessary pressure on Ford while ensuring that she remained integrated into the compound's professional community. Hayes, the intelligence specialist who had tried to befriend Ford early in her assignment, had gradually developed a relationship based on mutual respect rather than gender solidarity. Their conversations remained professional, but had acquired a warmth that reflected genuine trust and understanding. Hayes had learned to appreciate Ford's insights on logistics and operations, while respecting her boundaries about personal matters. The broader SEAL community at Little Creek had absorbed the lessons of Ford's story without necessarily knowing all the details. Word had spread through informal channels that assumptions about people's backgrounds could be dangerously wrong, that harassment could have consequences far beyond what perpetrators intended, and that strength came in many forms that weren't always immediately visible. New personnel arriving at the compound found themselves in an environment where respect was expected rather than earned through hazing, where questions about people's qualifications were asked privately and professionally rather than publicly and mockingly, and where the default assumption was that everyone had been assigned to their position for legitimate reasons that might not be immediately apparent. Ford herself had begun to heal in ways that went beyond the physical scars that would always mark her body. The psychological evaluation that had recommended administrative assignment had proven prescient. The routine work and stable environment had allowed her to process trauma in a way that constant operational stress would not have permitted. She had started sleeping better, the hypervigilance that had characterized her early months at Little Creek gradually giving way to something approaching normal rest patterns. Her interactions with colleagues had become more natural, less carefully managed, as she learned to trust that her carefully constructed boundaries would be respected. Most importantly, Ford had begun to consider what came next. Her assignment at Little Creek was temporary, a bridge between her extraordinary past and whatever future she chose to build. The healing that had taken place over the past months had given her options that had seemed impossible when she first arrived. The compound's commanding officer, Captain Williams, had made it clear that Ford could remain in her current position for as long as she found it beneficial. Her performance had been exemplary, and the improvements in morale and professional behavior among the SEAL teams had not gone unnoticed by senior leadership. Alternatively, Ford could request reassignment to other administrative positions that would allow her to continue serving while maintaining the low profile that her psychological recovery seemed to require. Her expertise was valuable in many contexts, and her preference for quiet service had actually made her more rather than less attractive to commands that needed competent personnel without drama or complications. But there was a third option that Ford had begun to consider more seriously as her confidence in her own psychological stability increased. DevGRU was always in need of experienced operators who could handle specialized assignments that required unique combinations of technical expertise and operational experience. Her torture survival had actually enhanced rather than diminished her value for certain types of missions. The conversation about her future had begun quietly, with informal discussions between Ford and senior personnel who understood both her capabilities and her needs. No decisions had been made, but the fact that such conversations were even possible represented a profound victory over the trauma that had once threatened to end her career entirely. On a warm Virginia evening, as Ford completed her final equipment checks for the day, she paused to reflect on the journey that had brought her to this moment of possibility. The scars that marked her body would never fade, and the memories of those 47 days in Somalia would always be part of her story. But she had learned something that her captors had never intended to teach her, that survival was not just about enduring trauma, but about finding ways to grow stronger from the experience. The harassment she had faced at Little Creek had initially threatened to break what her enemies had been unable to destroy, but her decision to trust her tormentors with the truth had ultimately created something better than what had existed before. The 4 SEALs who had knelt before her in that storage facility had kept their word about learning from their mistakes. Their changed behavior had rippled through the entire command, creating an environment where respect was genuine rather than forced, where strength was measured by character rather than aggression, and where everyone understood that they were part of something larger than their individual ambitions. Ford had not only survived her ordeal, she had transformed it into something that made everyone around her better. It was, she realized, perhaps the most important mission she had ever completed. As she walked across the compound toward her quarters, Ford carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced the worst that life could offer and emerged not just intact but stronger. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting familiar shadows across the concrete, but for Ford, everything looked different now. She had found her way home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.